Welcome to the second session of the Junior Professional Legal and Regulatory Tutorial Group round. My name is Jess Morton and I work at the Global CCS Institute and my office is based in Melbourne, Australia. We do have some new members in the audience today, so I will briefly go over the introduction from last week. I'd encourage you to make the most of the tutorial group by connecting with each other via the internet, reading as many of the session materials that you have time for, asking the lecturers and tutors questions throughout the session, and having a go at answering the short quiz. Craig will tell you a little bit more about the quiz at the end of this session. A different lecturer will present each week, and the lecture will be immediately followed with a tutorial discussion. The entire session will go for around 60 minutes. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our tutors and lecturer for this week. Thank you for logging in today. Craig Hart is a highly respected CCUS legal and regulatory advisor, lawyer, and professor. He is the ENN Group Associate Professor at Renmin University of China School of Environment and Natural Resources and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University's Energy Policy and Climate Program. As a practicing attorney, he has over 15 years' experience practicing law in the fields of project finance, carbon finance, and capital markets. He is currently conducting separate studies of CCS regulation, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the Asian Development Bank, covering 9 developing countries. Pamela Chomsky will co-facilitate this tutorial with Craig. I'm lucky enough to work with Pam at the Global CCS Institute, where Pam is the Senior Advisor, Policy and Regulatory Americas. Some of you may have met her before, either as part of her Atlantic Council work or through the Research Experience in Carbon Sequestration Program, otherwise known as REX. And this is the premier US CCS education and training experience and career network for young professionals. Pam is the founder and director of REX. Both Pam and Craig are really great facilitators and they've been incredibly active in the CCS space for some time, with many more successes and involvement than I can cover today. Because I'm keen to get on with our lecture, which will be delivered by Stephen Carpenter, who is the Vice President with Advanced Resources International. Sorry, I've been forgetting to flick through the slides. This is Craig, this is Pam, and this is Stephen Carpenter. Now Steve, today will be giving a lecture on the development of international standards for CCUS. He has 25 years of experience in the energy, mining, federal and international contracting industries. Mr. Carpenter is a trustee of the Energy Mineral Law Foundation, a member of the advisory board for the International Pittsburgh Coal Conference at the Swanson School of Engineering at the University of Pittsburgh. Importantly for today, Mr. Carpenter is the chair and head of delegation for the US Technical Advisory Group to ISO TC 265. Carbon dioxide capture, transportation and geological storage. Clearly, Mr. Carpenter is one of the best placed people in the world to give this lecture and we're grateful for your time. Stephen, Pam and Craig are invaluable resources and we urge you to take advantage of their time today by sending through your questions, which will start off the tutorial component of the session. So that's all from me. Stephen, welcome, and can you please take over from here?
I can. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much for this opportunity. As soon as my screen, there we go, gets the slideshow. Again, my name is Steve Carpenter, and I'm going to present today on TC 265. For the lawyers or lawyer want-to-bes in the room, if you have any issue with what I've had to say, it is not the responsibility of GCCSI, it's mine. If you're happy with the presentation, you find it valuable, please give GCCSI all the credit, which is certainly due them. My intent today is to cover these 6 aspects, talking briefly about CCS and why it's applicable to a standards practice, looking at standards in general, discuss Z741, which is the precursor to the ISO process, then dive deep into the ISO TC 265 process for CCS, talk about next steps, and round out with questions, comments, and concerns. Obviously, those of us that are here understand what CCS is. and its importance, but very briefly, from a U.S. perspective, CCS certainly falls in line with the administration and President Obama's overarching themes to address coal with CC and CCUS, with key infrastructure, and more recently than in the past, coordination internationally with other countries and processing what technologies we have here and beginning to share those technologies internationally. Very specifically to the U.S., there are a host of directives, initiatives, approximately 20, that deal with GHG emissions. We have two new opportunities, if you will, coming on board in the U.S. with the new NSPS, the new source performance standards, and the existing source performance standards, which will be significant in their regulation of GHG impacts to the U.S. Globally, obviously, CCS is vital. This slide comes from GCCSI's CEO, Brad Page, 2 weeks ago in Washington. Obviously, CCS is vital internationally, and lots of folks are looking to it as a mechanism for climate change mitigation. As a driver to that mitigation, policy and regulatory has to follow. And there are significant developments in North America and in Europe, as well as globally, which become drivers for ensuring that CCS is deployable. One of the aspects that I'll be focusing on today is on policy and regulation and not on technical issues. CCS in the United States, from a research and development standpoint, celebrated a decade last year. And at the annual conference, Stuart Dalton of EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, concluded his plenary session by making the statement that policy trumps funding and funding trumps technology. If you look at how our regulatory environment in the United States is shaping up, there's a myriad of things that have to be addressed. Specifically looking at CCS, this is actually a flowchart that was developed by the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It wasn't made as a cartoon to be facetious. It actually did highlight at the time it was drafted how the interface between all of the different organizations and standards and actions relative to CCS in the U.S. had to happen. So the point and the takeaway for this conversation is CCS deployment is not a technological issue. It is a policy issue and a regulatory issue, which leads to the notion from an international standpoint of a clean development mechanism. And that is, CCS now is an approved CDM under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so one asks the question then, how does CCS under a CDM come into practice? If you look internationally, there's certainly an awful lot of work happening around the globe with large-scale research projects, pending commercial projects, the U in CCUS for CO2 EOR, and international projects on all the major continents that are large GHG emitters. So we're going to focus for a moment on CDM as a framework for why and how an ISO standard is important. A clean development mechanism was established under the Kyoto Protocol and is managed by the UNFCCC. It primarily acts as the offset program for GHG reductions, and it does so primarily in developing countries. If you complete a project, in this case a CCS project, under a clean development mechanism, you generate a carbon credit or a certified emissions reductions, a CER. And that CER is the financial mechanism that allows financing, that allows the carbon to be monetized and tradable to influence and afford developing nations the opportunity to move forward with GHG mitigation through CCS. For a clean development mechanism to occur, it has to do 6 things. It has to address additionality. That is, it has to be above and beyond the business as usual. It has to be measurable, whether it's a measuring, monitoring, and validation, whether you call the MVA, MMV, or MRV plan. It has to be independently audited by a third party with no organizational conflicts of interest. It has to be unambiguously owned. There has to be clear ownership with, to eliminate double counting. It has to address and account for leakage outside of the project boundary, and it has to be permanent and non-reversible. If you do those things, you can arrive at a CDM. So setting the stage, let's talk briefly about standards, what they are, why they're important, and that will set the context to move into talking specifically about ISO. Standards as a whole are consensus-based. They're designed as a rule, a guideline, or definition. They are revisable and updatable and voluntary, and that predominantly makes them different from regulations, whereas regulations are very prescriptive and they're hard and fast and typically are not modified. The standards are designed to be fit for purpose. They're either prescriptive-based, thou shalt do X, or implement technology to reduce to a certain number. They're objective-based. The objective is to reduce GHG emissions regardless of the amount that you reduce, as long as you're reducing them. They have to be performance-based. You apply that technology to GHG emissions, and you arrive at a certain performance standard. Are they principle-based, or can they be some hybrid or collection of those four? Why are standards important? Ironically, they're important because they're not laws. Because they're not laws, they can work together with laws and regulations. Because they're not laws, they're not mandated, and they're voluntary, which certainly encourages participation. And by being non-mandated, for the most part, they're initiated by industry around the world as opposed to by regulatory agencies. And as such, you tend to get better participation. You have participation during the process, and therefore you have involvement and engagement in the outcome. Standards are important because they can be used to demonstrate regulatory compliance. In many jurisdictions, specifically in the United States, there is a federal law that allows any agency to adopt an international standard and say, our law equals that standard. And most international jurisdictions allow for the incorporation of existing international standards. So again, they're not laws, but they can work with, and in some cases can replace laws by being adopted. They certainly help regulate the streamline and the regulatory process by having the public engagement, the industry engagement throughout the process, so you don't get as much resistance and much more acceptance with the outcome. And probably one of the more important aspects is that they can harmonize across jurisdictions. As I showed you the two upper right and lower left slides previously, standards afford an opportunity to cross regulatory boundaries and certainly jurisdictions to make sense of these kinds of things. Recently in the United States, this past week, there was testimony on the new source performance standard that raised a whole host of new questions that could possibly be addressed by this and other standards. We also have an existing best available control technology, or BACT rules, in the United States that require CCS to be considered for all new power production. And again, standards can help cross and harmonize between regulations and jurisdictions. One thing they must not do is be exclusive. Regulations cannot exclude certain jurisdictions. So in the case of looking at a CCS standard, it has to include the United Nations, IPCC, ISO, European, EU European directives, those issues that come out of the United States, Department of Energy and EPA. Has to include the concerns of the NGOs, GCCSI, World Resources Institute, and it has to deal with existing federal, provincial, and state regulations. And one of my favorite is future expected directives. It's very difficult to look into that crystal ball and know what's going to happen a week, a month, a year, a decade from now, but standards do the best to do that. But one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, that separate them from laws is that they're revisable. They're dynamic documents that are still alive and can come back and be revisited as new directives come forward. Z741-12, that is the technical name for the world's first formally recognized CCS standard. It was began about 4 years ago in a cooperation between the United States and Canada. It incorporated the ISO standards 31,000, which are the risk risk management section, 17,000, which are the certification standards, and 14064 and 14065, which are the greenhouse gas carbon footprint standards. The Z741 was developed with the lead of IPAC-CO2, which is a now defunct organization, the International Performance Assessment Center for Geologic Storage of CO2, which was a joint effort between Shell Corporation and the University of Saskatchewan, with the guidance of the Canadian Standards Association, and authored by 40-some individuals, professionals between the United States and Canada. That document ultimately has been accepted by the American National Standards Institute and the Standards Council of Canada as existing viable international standard. Now, why is this important? Z741 plays two major roles. The first role that it fulfills, looking at the 6 requirements for a CDM to be a CDM, items number 3 and 4, the Z741 standard identifies independent auditability. It provides third-party certification, conflict of interest being addressed, and ownership across international boundaries. And items 3 and 4 were the 2 major lacking pieces that allowed CCS to move forward. Even though it was approved by the Kyoto Protocol as a CDM, there weren't any CCS project because items 3 and 4 were unaddressable, and Z741 provides that opportunity. Z741 was very successful because it brought together 2 nations and a whole host of companies, organizations, academic institutions, as well as industry. Those folks that you see represented there were all primary authors to the document. And the document's table of contents addressed these 9 major sections. 1, 2, 3, and 4 were relatively generalized, but 5, site screening, selection, and characterization, became very specific about how to select the site, go through the screening process, and characterize it, addressing the risk management, addressing the well construction, providing all the monitoring verifications, and importantly then closure of that process. So that life cycle is represented by the chart, the graph there on the right, which I will briefly mention as the irony of all ironies. This process was a very enjoyable process. It was long. It took about 3.5 years. But if you can imagine 40 very intelligent professionals in a room together, of those 40 people, there were 52 master's degrees held by those 40 individuals and 47 PhDs held by those same 40 individuals. Trying to agree on words and sentences and chapters can be very difficult at times. And it ultimately culminated, because this was, if you recall, a joint effort between the United States and Canada. It took the threat of missing the Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals in 2011 to actually cross the finish line, get to a sports bar, enjoy some beer, pizza, and watch Game 7 was actually the motivating factor to actually complete this process and get across the finish line. With that being said, let me back up 1 second. I have the starter's pistol there to remind me the other part of the irony of all ironies is the ISO process requires that an existing international standard be in place before ISO is willing to begin the process of developing a global standard. So it was the second item that I said that Z741 filled was the beginning of the ISO process. Without Z741, the process that I'm going to talk about now would not exist. I'm going to talk briefly about ISO as a whole and how the process works, and then we'll dive into the important stuff of TC265. ISO as a global system is represented by 163 countries. There are about 5,000 people within the organization of ISO itself, and within the countries and organizations that they represent, they believe that they capture 97% of the world's population. They represent a little over 600 organizations and have generated just under 20,000 standards to date. There are about 250 active technical committees that represent 3,335 technical bodies that encompass about 100,000 experts that you'll see in a moment. I'll bring up a slide. ISO acts as an organizational structure and not as a standard writing body. As an ISO standard is developed, it climbs a set of stairs, if you will. On the bottom left is a new work item proposal or new proposal. And in order to go and begin the process to get to the upper right to actually develop an international standard, there are several processes that the standard, the narrative, the actual words on paper have to go through. The first process is a working draft, and that is that the members of the working committee have to agree on consensus. They have to agree as to what they're going to agree on. And when you arrive at consensus, then that document, that standard, can take the next step to CD or a committee draft. And what you'll see quickly is as you climb the ladder, there's more and more scrutiny, more and more refinement that has to occur for that document to take the next step. In order to go from a working draft to a committee draft, and then from a committee draft to a draft international standard, not only do all the working groups have to have consensus, but 2/3 of the participating members also have to vote, and they have to vote in the affirmative to move from a committee draft to a draft international standard. Once a draft international standard is agreed upon, then it will move into a final draft international standard, an FDIS, and the level of scrutiny continues. Not only does the working group have to be in consensus, not only do 2/3 of the participating countries have to vote, but less than 1/4 of the total votes must be negative. Until that threshold is able to be accomplished, a FDIC cannot become a formal international standard. And the final international standard then requires 2/3 of the participating countries to vote and less than 1/4 of all total negative votes. When those increasing levels of scrutiny are arrived upon, the process moves forward, and until that happens, it does not move forward. ISO does not write standards. ISO is an organizational committee and a process committee. They manage the process of writing the standards, but they don't write the standards. So, for example, the technical committees will write the standards. If ISO feels the need to draft a standard on how to manufacture washing machines or manufacture fire trucks or do CCS, ISO reaches out to its member nations, and the member nations, the P members, collect, ask, and solicit participation from experts, from the general public, from academia, from industry, from consulting, to sit on those committees and actually write the standards. The member countries only approve the standards, and then the nations adopt the ISO standards, and ISO stays neutral on the technical content of the standard and only manages the process. It only manages the stepladder, if you will, of the process, but not the actual content of the process. There are approximately 4 different types of documents. An international standard is obviously the most recognized. There are technical specifications, there are publicly available specifications, and there are technical reports. All 4 of those follow the same process, but all 4 of them have different outcomes. If you recall, earlier we talked about the different types of standards, whether they be performance-based, whether they be a hybrid, depending on what type of standard you actually have, may determine whether or not you actually are drafting or writing a technical specification or a technical report. The process to draft a standard is limited to 36 months, and the process to approve and make that last step of addressing all the comments is 24 months. ISO's belief is that if you can't deliver the end product in 5 years, then the end product is not ready for prime time. The world is not in need of that, and so the 5-year time limit is prescribed. If you miss that time limit, you take a pause and you get to start over. So talk briefly about how the ISO TC265 committee is organized. The committee is chaired by what's called a secretariat. The secretariat is the manager or administrator of the process, and in this case, Canada's Canadian Standards Association, CSA, is the secretariat on behalf of ISO. ISO asks to twin or partner the secretariat, so they have a primary and a secondary, or backup, if you will. The Chinese are the twinned secretariats. So Canada leads and China has the co-convener or co-secretary role, excuse me, for TC265. Within TC265, the membership is comprised of two types of entities, countries and liaisons. Within countries, there are two types of countries. There are either P member or participating nations, or O member or observing nations. A country has a right to watch and be part of it, or to be fully engaged as part of this. And on the liaison side, there are a host of non-government organizations, NGOs like GCCSI, and others that act in a liaison status, in a liaison standpoint. From the U.S.'s perspective, the U.S. is a member country to ISO. Our official body that holds the vote on behalf of the United States to ISO is ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. ANSI has authorized CSA, Canadian Standards Association, has an American arm based in Cleveland. CSA America, or CSA Group America, manages the ISO process, ensuring that the process is followed appropriately from a process standpoint, not a content standpoint, on behalf of ANSI. And then members of the U.S. Technical Advisory Group, members of the U.S. TAG, are solicited from the general public, from academia, from industry, and from a host of others within the United States to make up the U.S. TAG. There are 18 participating countries. Those countries listed there are all P member nations. As a P member nation, each nation has one vote on, you remember the ladder, the step ladder, as we move through the process. When a standard is developed, a ballot will be issued, and each country gets a single vote. Those 18 countries all have voting status, and as a P member nation, those countries are guaranteed to be able to place their international experts on the individual working groups so that they can influence the process and make sure their country's interests are brought to bear and recognized throughout the process. An O-member nation, observing countries, those 9 countries have observing status. They do not get a vote. They attend meetings. They can request that their international experts participate on the working groups, but they're not guaranteed that seat. And those O-member nations can upgrade to P-member status at any time. The liaisons that exist, presently there are several. There are 3 existing ISO technical committees, the environmental management, the petroleum and natural gas, and the gas infrastructure, that liaise between TC265. There's enough overlap predominantly in the management system and on TC207. And TC67 and 234 is predominantly pipeline transportation of CO2, to make sure that the work that those 2 organizations, TC67 and 234, are doing don't conflict with what 265 is doing, and to make sure there aren't any gaps that are missed. And then there are a host of liaison, NGO liaisons, certainly most notably is the GCCSI, that participate by having their international experts participate in this process. Your hosts today and your tutors are part of that process and engage with us as we move forward in TC265. Now, the TC265 has working groups. There are 6 established working groups 1 through 6. And you can see that's the relatively flat structure. The working groups consist of capture, transport, storage, quantification, and verification. I put the MVA there as a U.S. citizen. We tend to talk about Q&V from a monitoring, verification, and counting standpoint. That's a little cheat sheet for myself. Working Group 5 is cross-cutting issues. those things that don't fit nicely into working groups 1 through 4. And then working group 6 is CO2 EOR, or CCUS. Working group 1, as I indicated, is capture. It is chaired by the Japanese. They tend to focus on pre and post anoxy fuel combustion. They're also looking at the industrial processes, separation, purification, all of the process of the CO2 from the flue gas to being pipeline ready, the quality of CO2 streams, monitoring and management systems of the capture, and dealing with plant retrofitting issues. The U.S. have 4 members from our tag that sit on that committee, and all 4 of those have lead author roles. Working Group 2 is transportation, led by the Germans. Their primary focus right now is pipeline transportation. There are 2 U.S. members that are on that committee, and their primary focus now is looking at pipelines not already covered by ISO TC 67. They're focusing on health, safety, and environmental issues and monitoring of CO2. The drawing that you see there is actually a boundary drawing that we are working on. We'll be working on next month in Berlin for the ability to draw a boundary, and I mean a standards boundary, not a geographical boundary, about what will Working Group 2 focus on and where will Working Group 2 start and stop their efforts, where will Working Group 1 begin and end their efforts, so as to ensure that there aren't gaps or conflicts in what the 6 working groups are working amongst themselves. It's a very intricate piece of work that they're trying to get settled. They're doing a lot of the upfront work now to figure out who's on first, to make sure that they don't duplicate or have redundant efforts, and then they will begin significant work in earnest to the work of identifying what's relative to pipeline transportation. Working Group 3 is storage. Working Group 3 has a joint leadership. Canada leads onshore storage. Japan leads offshore storage. They have adopted Z741-12 as their seed document. So they're beginning with the Z741 document. They have accepted that as a seed document, and from there they can do whatever they like with the document. They can accept parts of it. They can reject sections entirely. They're working right now to disassemble and to deconstruct Z741 and find out what's appropriate and not appropriate for Working Groups 3 specific effort. There are 8 U.S. members participating on that, and many of them have lead authorship or co-lead authorship roles. Working Group 4 is quantification and verification. It is led by the Chinese with support from the French. They tend to focus on project boundary and leakage, not dissimilar to what Working Group 2 is trying to draw a boundary over where the standards work will begin and end. Working Group 4 is trying to decide where the monitoring will begin and end relative to different working groups. They're looking at third-party verification and life cycle analysis. This Working Group 4 has significant international interest because this group will be the entity that has to interact most with the CDMs. How will ISO TC 265 be applicable to use in a cap and trade or a monetization system for carbon in the outside world? And presently there are 4 U.S. members that participate in that working group. Working Group 5 is cross-cutting issues. As I sarcastically indicated, anything that didn't fit well into Working Groups 1 through 4, this became the bucket to put those things in. Led by the French with support from China, sort of flipped over, reversed the management roles from Working Group 4. But primarily they're focusing on terminology and definitions. They're trying to collect from each of the other 5 working groups what are their terms and definitions. So for example, when Working Group 3 in storage uses the word reservoir or cap rock, or Working Group 6 for CO2 EOR, when they use the term reservoir and cap rock, do they mean the same thing? Working Groups 5 job is to determine whether or not they're meaning the same thing and to identify to those 2 groups, hey, we're both using the same word. We either have to agree on the definition or one of you has to change that term so that we have distinct functional terms amongst all working groups. Working Group 5 also does significant work in public participation engagement. And those of you that participated in round 1, Dr. Sally Greenberg, who participated and presented that for you, is a member of the U.S. TAG and is leading our effort from the U.S. on the public participation engagement in Working Group 5. We have 7 members, and Sally, as indicated, is one of them. Working Group 6, CO2 EOR. Some of you may know this as CCUS, Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage. It is led by the United States with support from Norway, and they're focusing specifically on CO2 EOR, low-pressure subsurface oil field operating environments, dealing specifically with reservoir and pore space issues specific to an operating oil field, dealing with the lateral stratigraphic traps in the target formation. They have significant work to do to coordinate with the other 5 working groups to ensure that the things that they're doing tend to be viewed as a subset of the other working groups. So a lot of effort is spent to coordinate and ensure that there aren't duplications or contradictions. Presently, this is shaping up to be one of the larger groups. 14 U.S. members, 1 from Norway, 5 from Canada, 2 from China, 2 from Japan, 1 from the IEA. Brings us to 26. I'll talk briefly in a moment. We have our next international meeting in Berlin in April. We expect the French, the UK to provide experts to be part of that committee, as well as additional liaisons to suggest their experts for participation in that committee. So you got an understanding of what ISO looks like and what we're doing. What are we doing next? There have been 3 meetings where all the nations come together, beginning in the summer of last year in Paris. 3 meetings occurred between Europe and Asia. We will be heading to Berlin in next month. Each of the 6 working groups will meet for 2 days of work, as well as 2 days of all 18 P member nations and 9 O member nations and the 9 liaisons all come together in plenary meetings. The U.S. TAG will meet again this summer, most likely in Cleveland. That's CSA's headquarters. It's expected that the working groups and the plenary of TC 265 would meet again in the fall somewhere. The expectation that we've had Europe and Asia that this would be a Western Hemisphere, either a U.S. or Canadian meeting. The spring of 2015, we're going to Norway. As I indicated previously, we've got 36 months to deliver a draft. That clock began last summer, and we've got 24 months to resolve any issues. So from a NASA perspective, we've cleared the tower, the clock is running, and we all have plenty of work to do. So with that, I have arrived at the question section, and I think I will hand it back over to Craig at this point.
Steve, thank you very much for the overview of the ISO process. It's a process that I think will be unfamiliar to most of us, and having you've been intimately involved in this from the early stages is a great resource. We've had about 6 questions come in, and each of these are very substantial questions. We're going to try to get to each of these. I'm going to start you off with first an organizational question, and then a question on transfer of responsibility. From an organizational point of view, why has the CO2 EOR portion of this been separated from just the traditional CCS portion? And then I'd like to ask you, how has the ISO process addressing the issue of transfer of responsibility, taking into account significant differences in approach under the EU and the US and other major jurisdictions, and how is the standard addressing this substantively?
Those are great questions, and I will try and answer them as succinctly as possible because we only have, I think, 20 minutes left. Talking about the first one of Working Group 6, CO2 EOR, I'm assuming everyone can still see that I'm driving and I've moved back to the organizational chart. And if you could place your hand and cover up Working Group 6 and look at that organizational chart, the ISO process began without Working Group 6. There were only 5 working groups. And as I indicated, Working Group 5, cross-cutting issues, anything that didn't fit well into 1 through 3 and 4 went into 5 because the ISO process began and it didn't include the United States and Norway, and it didn't include Working Group 6. Now, there is a political and a technical answer to the question of why. The political answer also ties to the technical answer. One of the reasons why CO2 EOR is separate is because arguably 99% of the CO2 EOR experience in the world resides in North America, resides between the U.S. and Canada. There isn't a lot of CO2 EOR experience outside of North America. Even though the United States has about 40 years of experience with EOR, that technique and process hasn't been adopted and isn't implemented widely around the world. So to have another country participate and act in that role, there wasn't the expertise to do that. Secondly, the U.S., because it has 99% of the CO2 EOR expertise, the CO2 EOR industry has great interest in trying to figure out, at the end of the day, Class 6 to Class 2 CO2 EOR, is it really storage? What does that mean for them? And that questioning and resistance caused the United States, for the first year of its participation, to be an O-member country. We were an observing country. So the United States was not eligible to have a participating role because they chose to be an O-member, an observing nation. And that is mainly driven by, I'm trying to work backwards to say, the Z741 document had a very little known statement that said it was applicable to saline and it wasn't precluded to be applicable to CO2 EOR. And the EOR industry took great exception with that statement to say, well, does that mean Z741 has to apply to us or doesn't apply to us? The authors took that as, we thought we were being giving them flexibility by saying it was their choice. The industry didn't take well to that, wanting something very prescribed to them so they knew how to react in the future from a risk management standpoint, and so there was resistance. And so that resistance culminated in the U.S. being a year late to the process. And so this past fall in Berlin, if you take your right hand and cover up Working Group 6 and you look at those countries participating, the U.S. and Norwegian as an industry, as a nation, has significant CCS expertise, but they weren't at the table. So a proposal was drafted, and the TC265 body accepted the formation of a 6th working group, CO2 EOR, and that it was accepted that the United States and Norway would co-convene. The U.S. is the leader, and Norwegians are the co-conveners of that, to bring the United States and the Norwegians as a nation, as an international leader in CCS to the table. And it also decidedly said, okay, EOR is on the table, but as opposed to just like with Z741, whether it's arguably in or out or questionably in or out or jurisdictionally in or out, EOR was carved out of Working Group 3 and put in its own bucket. And so Working Group 6 will only deal with issues relative to CO2 EOR, and that way Working Group 3 can move forward on the storage issue without having to wrestle with this, is EOR included or excluded, and it was felt that having a standalone issue for that was the best way to move forward. To get everybody to buy in, to have a standard that was better used because it had better participation, and it allowed industry and academics to come together and say, let's wrestle with the things we need to wrestle with, and let's not wrestle with the things we don't need to wrestle with. So I hope that, I know it's a very long-winded answer, and I'll try and use that as a translation to the transfer of liability to a U.S. versus EOR, U.S. versus EU perspective. And my response to that is, this is a blended international effort. There is no one jurisdiction that takes precedent. However, it can't be exclusive of jurisdictions. So those things that are specific to the EU or the US get included in. That's why it's important to have experts from those countries at the table in these working groups, bringing to the table the specific issues that exist for those nations and for those jurisdictions. Now, in the US, we differ from the rest of the world because we have private property ownership. In the US, we have private individuals, you or I, Craig, or Pam, could own property, and therefore we as private individuals could set the limit of liability we're willing to accept, or conversely be liable if we injected CO2 in the ground. For the rest of the world, the Crown or the state owns those subsurface resources. And so it's a much easier, much cleaner process for a government to say, we are going to require you to inject the CO2. We are going to deal with the liability and indemnification. And whenever you're done injecting and you've gone through the closure and monitoring process, we'll assume that liability at the government level. That's a unique issue that we have to deal with here in the United States because we're different than every other country in the world in that regard.
Thank you, Steve. Pam, do you want to take the next batch of questions?
I don't have them, Craig. They didn't come through, so if you could go ahead.
Okay, let me, Steve, we have a question on public engagement, and this was a question that Sally deferred to you. How does the ISO approach public engagement, and can you give us an overview of how the differences between US and EU regulatory processes have been reflected in the standard?
The ISO process has two stages of public comment, and so they differ from both the US and the European regulatory process, which both allow for public comment. The Europeans is slightly different than the US, but both regulatory processes allow for a draft regulation to go out for public comment, and all citizens, industry, liaisons, and others are allowed to give comment. What differs from the ISO process is twofold. First, the public can actually participate in the development of the standard. The public is encouraged to be members of the U.S. working group. They're encouraged to attend meetings, and they have the right to be on the committee, sitting at the table, and actually going through the sausage making, going through the minutia and the hard arguments and the heavy lifts and the debates of why we ought to do this or why we ought to do that or why we ought not to do this or not to do that. So the public has the ability to be engaged very early on in the making of that draft standard. Additionally, once a standard is drafted, as you, if I can get there quickly enough, you'll recall the step ladder, this piece. Each one of those pieces beginning with a DIS, a draft international standard, beginning at a DIS, the FDIS, and the ISO publication. All three of those standards, all three of those processes have an external public comment. That is, for the United States, through the American National Standards Institute, through ANSI. ANSI will publish the draft standard and invite anyone in the United States who has any comment to provide to the U.S. tag their comment. By process, the U.S. tag is required to address every comment. Dissimilar to a regulatory comment, if John Q. Public or Jane Q. Public submits a comment to the EPA has to take that comment into the public record, but they're not mandated to do anything with that public comment. Different in the ISO process is the U.S. tag is required to address all comments. As an example, the Z741, which is the precursor to the ISO process, follows a very similar process. The final draft of the Z741 received 537 public comments. those 40 authors were required to sit down. We actually locked ourselves in a hotel for 3 days, and we had to go through all 537 comments, and they can't be dismissed out of hand. They can be dismissed if they don't have technical merit or if they're raising an issue that's been addressed somewhere else. So in that regard, the public has a much more significant role to both be impactful and significant to the outcome of the process by being part of the sausage-making process itself, and by virtue of the public comment process on a draft requires every public comment to be addressed in some form or fashion.
Now, Steve, so at the ISO level, you've got a public engagement process that's very sophisticated. Does the standard itself then contain requirements for public engagement at the project level, and what do those look like?
Typically they do. Certainly the working group 4, which is quantification, 5, working group 5. Sally Greenberg is our lead for the U.S. on that, and they are focusing a whole section on developing what ought to be the public's engagement. And yes, they are looking at this from a site selection and process standpoint, very similar to what Sally has done for the U.S. through the Department of Energy's work that she does. Obviously, she's carrying that forward, representing the U.S. experience, both good and bad, and she then is engaging with members from, I believe there are 11 nations represented on that committee, and so those other nations are bringing forth their public participation and engagement successes, stories, shortcomings, and they all get together in a room and say, listen, we have a goal of engaging the public when ought to be that appropriate time and process, and they're trying to meld 6 or 7 different nations' experiences. Certainly the Europeans and the Australians have great success and have been, I would say, further ahead than the U.S. in the public participation engagement. And so I can't tell you specifics. I certainly can share back with you into our participants after the fact in Berlin. Sally will be spending 2 days in Berlin, doing the heavy lift of where are we in advancing the notion of developing that section on public participation engagement. But it's a very active and integral process that they're in year 1 of a 3-year process to get a draft completed.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the CDM has its own separate public engagement requirements. So
correct.
It sounds like you will see public engagement from different levels in the process and from multiple country perspectives.
I think it will be very much a cradle to grave. You will see the public participation in the standard development aspect, and then in the site selection process, and certainly at the end of the day, if the CCS project is used through the CDM, you're absolutely correct. There's a whole host of separate public engagement requirements in order for the CDM to be valid, and all of those are taken into consideration. That's really part of the conflict, if you will, and the sausage making that Sally and her colleagues are dealing with is how do you look at all of these requirements for public participation and come up with a framework that harmonizes them, that makes sure that they're not exclusive of a process. I mean, imagine going through all this elaborate 5-year issue and get to the end of the day and you scratch your head and say, oh my gosh, we forgot to deal with the CDM aspect of public participation. So they're trying to put all of these potential opportunities and or requirements for where the public engagement needs to be inserted and how it needs to be inserted and how it needs to be responded to in this process, and ensure that they are addressed along the way. And I would say that this is probably the most elaborate effort to engage the public, from an initiation, from a process and comment standpoint. I can't imagine a process that has more public engagement than this will when it's completed.
Pam, do you want to follow up with any public engagement?
No, I don't have any further comments on public engagement, but I'd like to stick with the ISO process discussion a little bit and just turn it to the geological modeling aspects. So geological modeling of different storage sites, in many respects, it's a subjective task. Can we make an international standard for that, and how has the ISO process approached this?
The third bullet here of site characterization is really where that work's being done, and there's actually a standalone section within Working Group 3. There are many sub-working groups. Risk management is one of them, and site characterization / modeling is the other. And the question that you're asking is the one that's being raised. How much modeling, how much characterization, how much information about our site is appropriate? And so that is certainly something that is being wrestled with. There are about 3 legitimate, and I hate to use that word, there's about 3 different models that are widely used in the world today. And one of the tasks that this group is looking at is one better than the other, and they're trying to certainly stay away from that. I think they're going to arrive at a place where they say, maybe we ought to use all 3 and blend the modeled results and see if we're getting any significant differences. But you raised a great question that a lot of standards early on, or a lot of the process early on in this, Pam, people felt there was a cookie cutter approach. If we could say that characterization, you need to drill X number of wells to X depth, we should be fine. And I think certainly through the Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership research in the United States under DOE, one of the major takeaways is geology is very heterogeneous. It's very much not homogeneous. That is, the site is the site, and you can only extrapolate very little things from one site to the other. And so the largest takeaway has been we probably ought to do more work on characterization, and they're discussing now the balance between how many holes should we drill. Obviously, real-time data, real core is much better than modeled work. But at the same time, do you have to balance the financial and the time frame of, do we require X amount of wells to be drilled and X amount of core to be taken? That may be preclusive, especially in many developing nations where the finances to provide initiation for these projects are lacking. So the modeling question, it's kind of ironic that something we've taken for granted for decades here in the U.S. and in many countries around the world tends to be that leading factor for what are we going to do and how are we going to do to say we've done enough characterization. There's some very, very intelligent modelers from a host of countries. I know the Japanese, the Chinese, the Canadians, the U.S., and the Brits have many experts that are focusing primarily on this. And again, we're only a year into the process, but I think your question is very much on the mark of what they're wrestling with. How they've wrestled with it, what the answer is probably 12 to 18 months out yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks
Steve,
for that. Craig,
yeah.
Go ahead. I think
Steve,
we have time for one more.
Okay. Steve, you mentioned technology. How does the evolution of technology inform the ISO standard, and are there any patents involved or essential technology to the implementation of the standard?
There are, and if I can get to a slide, the Working Group 1 is a bit unique in that they most likely, Working Group 1 is capture led by the Japanese, they most likely will not provide an international standard. They are presently working on the 4th bullet, a technical report, for the reasons you just asked. Because carbon capture is very much technology driven. MHI, Alstom, all of the major technology providers have patented work that a lot of that information is not in the public domain. It's not shareable. It's protected as confidential business information. So the Japanese have taken a slightly different approach to Working Group 1, and they're doing an exhaustive literature review, and they're going to provide a technical report. At the end of the day, if you're going to do carbon capture, I think everybody would agree that you're going to have a very short standard that says you need to capture the amount of GHGs that you need to capture, and that end CO2 stream should be 92 to 98% CO2 with some limited other off gases. You're going to minimize the hydrogen sulfide in there so you don't have corrosion. You're going to minimize the oxygen and nitrogen. That's simple. How you get there, I don't think the standard will prescribe. I think how they will get there is to say, listen, here are the available technologies that exist in the world. It will be up to, you know, Southern Company, Duke, AEP, the French General Service provider in France, to decide who they're going to buy the equipment from. The standard will never be in a position to be able to say, you must buy this technology or that technology. So the Japanese are focusing on what I'm paraphrasing by calling a massive literature review to say, here's what's available in the marketplace. Because the standards are fluid, they're updatable, the ISO process allows them to go back in, say every year, every 18 months, as the technology advances, as new things come on the market, to simply say, now here is a year later updated technical report of the available technologies in the marketplace. So yes, that's if you look at transportation and storage and the monitoring, those are engineering principles. We're talking about geology where they're not necessarily technically driven, but it's all driven about doing the engineering to porosity and permeability to push CO2 into that rock. The capture is different, as you've indicated. It's very technology driven, which tends to deal with patents and confidential information. And I think that the Japanese leading Working Group 1 have taken a very novel approach that I think will be valuable in the end to simply provide carbon capture opportunities, what's available today in the marketplace, realizing that all of these will get you to where you need to be. That is at least 94% pure CO2, this much compression, XYZ PDQ.
Great, thanks for that, Steve. I think we're going to take one more question here, if that's okay. Based on your experience with the ISO process, with the Class 6, which is the US EPA well class for geologic storage, would that be a suitable model for international standards? And how might an international organization supervise a permitting program?
I think there's two answers to that question. The first is certainly Class 6 versus Class 2. In the United States, we have, through the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act, we have the Underground Injection Control, or the UIC rules. And within the UIC, we have Class 2, which are EOR wells, and Class 6, which are commercial CCS wells. The first answer to your question is certainly the Class 6 is a good marker or standard that can be carried forward internationally. Now, having said that, we also have to acknowledge that every country has to be comfortable with what's being brought to the table. So this ISO standard will not be a EPA-looking standard, nor will it be an EU directive standard. As I indicated early on, they can't be exclusive. They can't keep things out. And so by virtue of not being able to exclude the Class 6, certainly in the U.S. where there are Class 6 requirements, those mandated requirements in the U.S. are going to have to find their way into the ISO process for the ISO process to have value in the United States. That's where the U.S. participation, being here in the U.S. and getting those experts on the table talking about what Class 6 is and what it means, has great value. The other side of that coin is we're always talked about as members of this to be conscious of the U.S. perspective because of who we are. By that I mean because the U.S. has so much expertise, because our regs are a little bit more advanced in some instances than other countries, there is resistance from other countries to say, listen, if we wanted to just adopt the U.S. rules, we could have done that. But we're trying to get a blended, internationally acceptable process. So I think at the end of the day, the Class 6 has some great takeaways and some aspects of it that are going to be of great value. I know domestically in the U.S. there's a lot of contention and issue between a Class 6 versus a Class 2. That is, how do you convert all the CO2 EOR work that's going on right now, which are done under Class 2 rules, into permanent storage under CCS? the EOR industry doesn't want to just say, okay, we'll just convert everything from Class 2 to Class 6. Economically, that's not going to work. It also won't probably work that Class 6 would just be generically broadcast and every well in the world should look like Class 6. My guess is it's going to be some combination and hybrid of the good pieces, the monitoring, verification, and construction aspects to ensure long-term viability. 50, 100 years, 500 years that are part of Class 6 are certainly going to make their way into the process, and they're going to make themselves in the process in working group 3 for storage. That's where they're talking about well construction and the monitoring and verification. That's where all that work will take place in the well construction and the risk assessment and management. But at the end of the day, I don't think it will look just like a Class 6 because not every nation believes philosophically or engineeringly that those pieces that are in and make up Class 6 are appropriate for their nations. That's what this process is about, is how do you find something that's appropriate in Australia, in China, in Japan, in Poland, and also applicable in the United States. Hope that answers your question.
Good. Very good. Excellent. Well, I think that covers all the questions that we had inputted. Craig or Jess, did you want to have any follow-ups? It takes us now to our hour and our closing.
We are at the end of the session. Steve, thank you again for the terrific presentation.
My
we may
pleasure.
have some additional questions for you from the group, and there's a mechanism on the intranet site for submitting questions. Steve will get those, and we'll get responses back to you. And I think, Steve, you can also be also contacted if anyone's interested in the ISO process directly as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. I will, right there, the bottom right is me. You're more than welcome to call me. I'll actually answer the phone or email me anytime.
Thank you. And we will have quiz questions up on the internet shortly, followed by model answers within several days, which is a useful way for everyone to test their own knowledge. It's ungraded, but we encourage you to do that. A reminder that session 3 is the same time next week. We'll have a presentation by Diana Papioi of Denton's law firm in Romania. The topic will be the EU CCS directive, 3 different approaches, the UK, Netherlands, and Norway. Thank you, Steve, once again, and this concludes our webinar for today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.